So I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Bunurong on the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to Aboriginal leaders, elders past, present and emerging. At QueersInScience, we also acknowledge that in many ways, Aboriginal people in Australia were the first scientists and have been practicing the scientific method for over 60,000 years.
Let's get started with our speakers tonight. We have two capable, wonderful individuals tonight. We're going to start off with Guy. Guy is a proud Maori, the creative director of PermaQueer, coming all the way from Queensland to teach us about the natural world and how we can exist with the world in a more sustainable manner rather than the traditional destruction that we tend to do every day when we interact with, all the systems around us. I'm not an expert in the field, obviously. That's why we have Guy. So I'm going to hand over to Guy. Thank you.
Hi, kia ora everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to Melbourne Museum, QueersInScience, Midsumma Festival and all the other collaborators for having this platform and all of the work that they do. Thank you for introductions. As I said, I'll be talking on ancestral biology and how we connect to place, to people, and hopefully to our future. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're on today. If everyone can be really conscious right now of the breath that you take in. That breath comes from Wurundjeri ecology. That breath comes from the trees, it comes from the soil, it comes from our landscape. And the way that we're treating this ecology is not in alignment with it thriving or developing or taking care of us. This land was never ceded, it was stolen, and ongoing destruction is damaging how we relate to our landscape. Sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to acknowledge the elders, past, present, and the emerging leaders, and recognize that what we do on this country and how we relate, it's about us leveraging our privilege so that that story is told and that solidarity and an agreement and land is given back. I have two QR codes here. If there are any Indigenous people or Torres Strait Islanders present, I would like to pay my respects to you. If you want to support, there is Pay the Rent there, which I recommend everyone do. It's a really fantastic way to support financially. And if you can't do that, there's also Our Islands, Our Home. It's a campaign run by Torres Strait Islanders, and it's about maintaining sovereignty on their landscapes as well. Thank you. Icon, person, identity, who am I? I'm going to start with karakia. E te atua, ho mai kia mātou, tau māramatanga, tau rangi Māori e, tau kahame tau aroha, mo tēnei rā, ake, amene. For me, that is a way of blessing my environment. It's a way of acknowledging where I am. It's a way of acknowledging what's around me and what I'm relating to. For me, my culture is very, very important, and it's how I interrelate to the environment around me. It's how I relate to the people around me, and appropriate relation to ecosystem and other people is something that we're lacking in this world. Hence why I'm here talking about the subject today. But enough about me. Who are you? What are we? How do we view ourselves as individuals? How do we view ourselves within a culture? From my observations, primarily identifiers we have in this culture is our job, our ego, our thoughts, and our actions. And that sort of dictates who and how we behave and what values we put on other people, and also what values we hold ourselves. Now, the concept of ancestral biology doesn't really live in the individual. It doesn't really live in the person. It doesn't really live in our job. I mean, I hope it does. I would like for it to live all throughout the economies that we exist within, but unfortunately it doesn't. And because of that, we're seeing ecological destruction. So a better question than who are you is, what are you? What constitutes the you that has come today? So we can break it down biologically. We have our skeleton, we have our nervous system. Somewhere in me today, there's like half a cheesecake that I had for lunch, and there's muscles. And this is all cellular generation and regeneration, but after time, these cells also break down. And so they get cycled out. And what they get replaced with is the generation of new cells that come from our food. And where does our food come from? We know our food comes from our ecosystems, of which we rely upon. And they're fueled by oxygen, everything else that requires for us to grow. So if we're constantly regenerating, what remains? What is that one thing that is able to design the pattern and the idea and the behavior as we move forward? How does our hand remain a hand? Why does it not become a foot? How, when we have children, they grow up into beautiful little babies and new human beings. So this core essence of what is you that passes through time, that cycles through the whole ecosystem, through what we eat and how we breathe and our waste products and how we integrate. There's a core essence that is you, that is biological, that's in your DNA, that's also behavioral, and that's held within culture, and that's held within how we relate to others and to ourselves. So it's a really interesting question, what remains? And I implore everyone to think about that for a while and think about how we relate to what is it at the essence of who we are. This is my prompt at Pattern. So background about me, I run PermaQueer, so it's permaculture, which is sort of applied ecological design. We primarily work in mitigation and regeneration of ecosystems, social spheres and communities. So whilst I'm very interested in the details and the academic flows of how an ecology works, I'm more interested in the practical application of that, because as we can figure out and calculate and find the statistics of how climate change is destroying the ecosystem, but that doesn't actually do anything about it. So one of the core things in permaculture is patterns. There's something really fantastic about patterns and the world that we live in, and is that there's only a handful of forms that exist in the world. And these forms repeat themselves and they become patterns. And once you recognize what these patterns are, they can be branching patterns or spiraling patterns or dendritic patterns, you know what happens. And strangely, that's an ability to forecast. And I don't expect people to understand how to forecast these patterns, but it's how ecosystems work. And so within applied ecology, we try and identify what these patterns are. So when we think about who we are as people and what we are as organisms, there's a pattern in gardens that I'd like to bring our attention to, and that's true to type. So you would have let's say we had a garden and we were growing carrots, and we want to grow the same carrots every year. What's happening currently with genetic modification is you have this plant grow, but all of the successive years, they do not grow the same carrot or same vegetable or same plant. So that we would classify as not true to type. What true to type is an organism that replicates itself and replicates its role within an ecosystem consistently. And when this consistency happens over time, we can have ecological stability between organisms, because that repetition allows for consistent environmental factors for other organisms to work around. So true to type organisms are really good. But what does it mean to be a true to type human being? What is our type? What is our type that lived 50 years ago the same to this? Can we compare ourselves to plants? Is that something that we could do? So understanding what our function is can be really difficult, and what our role is in the ecosystem. So another pattern that I'd like to draw our attention to is one called ecological succession. And this is the process of, the natural process of remitigating and regenerating landscapes. So take, for example, we have a plain that has been completely destroyed, desolate entirely of all life, and we've just got dead soil on the ground. The first thing that would come into that environment, you see down there, we've got a little wind. The only thing acting in that environment would be the wind. And so airborne seeds, airborne organisms are the first to come in. This starts a process of ecological succession. Following that, we have these small grass species, because these are ones that are pollinated and seeded via the wind. And as they start growing up and dying, they contribute biomass to the soil. And soil starts to attract more microorganisms, and these microorganisms contribute to more cycling of nutrients and water. Then we start to have mature grasslands developing. As the biomass increases, the microorganisms continue to churn through and make this biomass more readily available. And also that attracts more insects. As more insects come, birds will come. Birds will come from neighboring ecosystems, and they bring with them their feces. And in their feces are further varieties of small berries and shrubs. So they're continuously seeding. This is a process of ecological succession. If you look down the bottom, there's those little dots. They represent the soil. And as this succession occurs, more biomass goes in and the soil profile builds. After this, we have nitrogen fixing plants come in. So these are really, really incredible and crucial points to our ecological succession, in that nitrogen fixing plants have this node in their root structure, and inside that lives a bacteria called rhizobium. Rhizobium is the reason we have nitrogen available to plants in our soil. So this fixes it from the air that comes down into the soil and makes it readily available for plants. At this point, we start having nitrogen-seeking plants enter the ecosystem. So as we can see, the soil profile continues to develop. We continue to get complexity in this ecosystem. The red dots are the nitrogen, and then we start to have fungal dominance in the soil as well. Now, this is biological diversity. The more organisms, types of organisms, and diversity within these organisms, the more functions that we have. And all of these organisms are true to type, at least they behave that way. And then we start to get more complex and larger trees and plant species come in. And this actually starts bringing water into the ecosystem. Trees can actually be viewed as vertical lakes. They are can't think of the percentage off the top of my head, but they are pretty much just water. And what they do is they cycle that water through the ecosystem. So that brings in wetland birds and starts to develop wetland bird species. And then we have a mature ecosystem. We have our apex trees come in, and then we have all of the other organisms that can live within that ecosystem. Now, all of these, this is over the process of, hundreds of years that we get to this point. The reason why it is important is because this apex here at this end is resilient. This apex here is what provides us with oxygen. It's what provides us with ecological buffers. It's what provides us with moisture in the air. And as we know, these spaces are being destroyed. So why is this relevant to ancestral biology? Well, what does it mean for us to be a custodian species at this end of the ecosystem? Put your hand up if you live in a fully mature, developed ecosystem. Kind of. We don't know. We don't know. For so long, we have been disconnected from what it means to live in thriving ecosystems. The baseline that we have of maintaining and looking after our environment is so low. So where does this knowledge actually exist? How do we understand how to relate to our environment, and why is that important? And if you don't know why it's important, I would just read a book. So yeah, what is the responsibility of a custodian species? So this is the second time I brought up these little guys here. They're ginkgo trees. They're actually dinosaurs. They come from the Jurassic period. They're really cool plants. They behave in a really weird way. But they're a perfect example of maintaining ecological harmony, because in the 1600s, these trees, who were a cornerstone of an ecosystem there, almost went entirely extinct. And these trees were very, very important to the Chinese monks. And they played a cornerstone in their medicinal framework. And they noticed that they were going extinct. And so they put their social and ecological networks to use to ensure that this ecology and that this plant and the role that it played in our ecosystem was maintained. So what does it mean for us to maintain ecological harmony, and how do we even begin to do that in the space and the world that we live within? Well, for me, that looks like traditional ecological knowledge. So what is that? How do we even figure that out? There's a misconception that we have in the world that I'm witnessing, that we are all kind of these modern creatures that live in the 21st century, and we are sort of like consumery people, and that's like our lot, and then we recycle and compost and continue on our way. And the truth is we all come from incredibly diverse backgrounds. Settlers, this is another thing they see in sort of racial spaces. White settlers, wherever you came from, there was a place there. There was a culture there. There was something happening there. A lot of the Scottish migrants and Irish migrants and Italian migrants, they have incredibly deep and incredibly rich ecological cultural values. And what's difficult for us in this society is that we can't recognize what it is or what it looks like or how this convention occurs. So this is what I'll offer for cultural conventions. This is a hungi. This is how Māori people greet each other traditionally in New Zealand. You see, it's a nice greeting. That's cool. We love that. But what's really going on there for me is when you meet someone and when you share a breath with them, which is what I tried to do at the beginning with us, when you share a breath in close proximity, a really fantastic thing happens on a nervous system level. If anyone works in body working or health spaces, you know the importance of co-regulation with other people. When you have a process of deep co-regulation, sharing a breath and sharing that space with people, there is a sense of belonging, there is a sense of understanding, there is a sense of respect, and this can transcend a lot of conflicts. This can transcend a lot of misunderstandings, and this can allow space and respect and time for listening. Now, how does that relate to ecological knowledge? How does that relate to our environment? Well, one of the deepest misunderstandings that we have about the climate crisis is that we don't have the solutions. We do. We've had them for a long time. We just don't know how to work together. And we haven't had that actual action for a while. So all of a sudden, a way that we can relate to each other that's meaningful, that's respectful, that builds mana, which is a sense of reciprocity and connection and power between you, is very, very effective. Again, this wouldn't be, it's like a hug. People be like, oh, I don't know how a hug can solve climate change. Another one is our calendar. So the Maramataka calendar is the sort of foundation of how our cultural convention works in Māori culture. The lunar cycle happens quite a lot. Actually, it never stops. And every cycle means something different. And every 3 days within that cycle, within the within the year's cycle means something different as well. So every 3 days in our culture is something completely different. So you have a birthday every 3 days consecutively throughout the whole year. That is how diverse and nuanced our ecosystem is. And we've tried to homogenize, dilute, and destroy that nuance because it's easier to communicate and it's easier to extract resources if you do that. We also have ceremonial aspects. Ceremony and ritual is a really powerful way to again drop into that co-regulation space with community, with environment, and understand what your shared needs are. And at the core of this crisis is a shared need for home. It's a shared need for an ecosystem. It's a shared need for food, and it's a shared need for all of the other creatures that live in our environment. With cultural conventions such as smoking ceremonies and cleansing ceremonies, there's so much more. I mean, from a sort of scientific perspective, like I mean, this isn't the use of sage, but sage has very, very powerful antifungal and antibacterial influence. So not from just a spiritual perspective, although it is a very powerful spiritual cleanser, they do actually have practical application as to how our physical bodies relate to each other. And then also adornment. Cultural adornment is about identity. It's about who you are. I'm wearing my Pounamu earrings here because they mean an incredible amount to me. We have this weird idea about spirit and sacredness and belonging and value that's sort of imbued into objects. And so I'll put it into a sort of, I don't know, loosely related to a physics perspective. Put your hand up if you're wearing a watch. Yeah, I've got a lot of watch wearers in here. Put it down if it's an Apple Watch. That one doesn't count to me. If it says quartz on it, put your hand up. No? Any analog watch? Yeah, we've got 3 of them. Cool. So quartz, that means there's crystal quartz in your watch. That acts as the oscillator. So the energy that's coming through that is oscillated by that crystal quartz. And basically what we're doing to figure out what time is right now in that watch is we're using the memory locked in that stone to tick out time. So how the electricity is oscillated through that equates to 1 second in our time. So our whole world is based on the ancestral knowledge that's locked in that rock. And that's why I wear these, is because popping back to the who am I really? Who am I? What is this thing that keeps replicating itself and using the resources of our ecosystem to do that? Before me, I was a part of my mother and my father. Before that, they were part of their ancestors. And one way that they connected to their landscape is by entraining themselves into the cultural jewels that we have. And I don't have all the answers as to how you or how we can connect to what this knowledge is. All I know is there was a time where we were able to live in harmony with the environment. And for whatever reason, we've decided to push over that threshold of what our ecosystem can look after us, of how our ecosystem can look after us. So really, whichever way we can find out where it is that we come from, and whichever way we can try and put ourselves in that place, whatever stories we can have with our elders, and whatever cultural artifacts we can decide to re-immerse ourselves into, will play a huge part in how we discover to move our culture forward. There's one thing that I know everyone knows in this room, is we do have to have a drastic change in culture. And actually, all of that knowledge still lives within every one of us. We just have to find out how we can remember that. So who are you, is my question at the end of this. I pose to everybody to figure out what their whakapapa, their genealogy, their ancestral line is. Figure out what did it look like to live in that ecological harmony with the environment where you're taking care. And how can you bring that behavior, that true to type behavior that is you, into how you live? Another reason why I would advocate infinitely for being able to connect to that ancestral line is I don't ever feel alone at any point, because I know who I am is not who I am. I'm pushed forward by the winds of my ancestors, and I'm pulled on the tides of my descendants, and no one and nothing can take that away from me. Thank you.
All right. Hi. That was really good. Hey. Our second speaker is Professor Bob Wong from Monash University, the head of Behavioural Ecology Research Group. That's really impressive. So today's talk is going to be about evolutionary ecology in Australia and how we are impacting the evolution process. Bob is the expert, so I'm going to hand over to Bob. Yeah? Let's do it. Let's do this thing.
Thank you. So I actually decided to walk over from my apartment tonight to the museum and not far from here, if you know Melbourne well, there's a white building with the face of an Indigenous elder, William Barak, immortalised on the facade. And I'm reminded when I was about to cross the road seeing the image of William Barak that he was also an accomplished artist, and his works are held in public institutions right across the country, including here in this museum. And if you study his works, which capture ceremony, you'll also see images of wildlife, things like echidnas, snakes, goannas, emus, and beautiful lyrebirds. And I'm reminded when I'm about to cross the road that the First Nations people, when we're acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of the land, were also the very first ecologists in this region. So I do pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and future, and also acknowledge their important contributions to our understanding of ecology. So I'm going to be talking about sex in an increasingly changed and changing world. Now, I'm a behavioural ecologist, which means that I spend a lot of time studying animal behaviour from an ecological and evolutionary perspective. And I spend a lot of time thinking about sex. And I know some of you probably also spend a lot of time thinking about sex. And I'm sure everyone in the audience here would appreciate that sex, even at the best of times, can be rather challenging. And I know some of you probably spend a lot of time, too much time, on dating apps and would be familiar with the fact that sex, or the pursuit of sex, can be extremely time-consuming. We also know from studies of animals that they can be extremely energetic and taxing to perform, things like courtship. And in some species, it can also be extremely dangerous. So here I have a picture of a male spider, the little brown critter, and you can probably also see the much larger female next to him. Male, when he's approaching the female, has to tread very carefully because a misstep could actually result in him being devoured before he even has a chance to mate. Now, most of you would be familiar with Charles Darwin and his concept of natural selection, which he came up with to explain the evolution of traits, including behaviours that are driven by what he described as the struggle to survive. But of course, Darwin recognised that merely surviving wasn't enough. Animals also have to reproduce, and he came up with the concept of sexual selection to explain the evolution of traits that are driven not by the struggle to survive, but rather by the struggle to reproduce. And evolutionary biologists today recognise sexual selection as a really powerful evolutionary force that's responsible for much of the weird and wonderful diversity of life on the planet. It's responsible for the evolution of the bright colours and the tail streamers that we see in this bird of paradise. Sexual selection is responsible for the evolution of weapons such as the antlers that we see in these stags, which have evolved to allow males to fight one another for access to females. It's also responsible for rather bizarre looking genitalia. So this is the first of two dick pics that I'm going to show you tonight. This penis belongs to an insect called a seed beetle. And you will notice that it's equipped with spikes. And we see these kinds of really bizarre genitalia in a whole range of different species. And evolutionary biologists studying these genitalia will be able to tell you that these things have evolved in some cases to allow males to scrape out sperm that might be already present inside the female reproductive tract, you know, as males compete to be the ones to try and fertilize the female's eggs. In other species, these kinds of genitalia have evolved to cause maximum damage inside the female reproductive tract so that she's not able to mate again. Sexual selection is also responsible for the evolution of some really bizarre sperm traits as well. So recent research from North America showed that the sperm of male peromyscus mice will actually cooperate. So several sperm from the same male will actually bundle together like this image here. And this will actually allow the sperm bundle to swim a lot faster through the female reproductive tract as the sperm of different males try to compete for access to the female's eggs. And sexual selection is also responsible for some really bizarre behaviours as well. So one of the most bizarre is sexual cannibalism, seen in many species of animals, such as this praying mantis here. The females just about to finish her meal of the male. And evidence suggests that in some species, males are complicit in this sexual cannibalism. It actually prolongs the amount of time that he's able to spend copulating with the female. So essentially he's being eaten alive, but in so doing, he's also able to have longer copulation time with the female and hopefully ensure that he's able to fertilize more of the female's eggs. Now, in most species, males are the most competitive, more competitive sex. We're larger, more brightly colored. We're equipped with weapons like these enlarged mandibles that we see in these stag beetles, and they compete vigorously with one another for access to mating opportunities with females. In many species, females, by contrast, tend to be the more discerning sex, as this female Victoria riflebird is showing, as the male's trying to desperately woo her. And by being choosy, evolutionary biologists recognize that females can gain a whole range of benefits, which we categorize into two different types. The first are what are known as so-called material or direct benefits. So by being choosy in this instance, females are able to gain access to males that are able to provide good territories or good resources to her. Or in the case of this poison dart frog from Central America, it's also about gaining access to a good father that will take care of the kids. The second category of benefits are so-called genetic or indirect benefits. So in this case, females are choosing males that can deliver good genes. And a very nice example of this actually comes from Australia, these beautiful birds called Gouldian finches. So in this particular species, males literally wear their genes on their heads. So those who are familiar with Gouldian finches will be able to tell you that there are some individuals that have red heads, like this individual in this image. There are some birds that have black heads, and there are also some birds that have yellow heads. And researchers have found that females actually prefer to mate with males that have the same head color as themselves, and in so doing end up choosing mates that are genetically compatible, and they end up producing more viable offspring. So it's not hard to imagine that the operation of sexual selection, male competition, and female mate choice can have a direct bearing on both the quality and the quantity of offspring that are produced. And this can in turn influence population health and viability. And of course, we know that species don't exist in a vacuum. So the health of population of one species can impact the health of the populations of others, because different species are all connected to each other in the ecological communities in which they inhabit. We also know that reproduction is finely attuned to the environments in which they have evolved. So take this example of the bird of paradise. Its bright colors and elaborate courtship displays have really evolved to allow it to stand out against the forest background. So what happens when environments change as a result of human activities? Well, we all know that humans have brought about unprecedented changes to environments around the world. And it's important to try and ask, well, what impacts might this have on reproduction and the mechanisms of sexual selection? Because it can help us to understand why some species are able to thrive or even become pests in human-altered environments, whereas other species end up floundering. So it's not all bad news, of course. Here are some good examples. An example close to home, a species of bowerbird. Male bowerbirds build these elaborate bowers, and they decorate the court of their bowers with found objects, usually fruits and flowers and maybe shells of snails. But you can see that this bowerbird living in an urban environment has actually decorated the court of his bower with all kinds of found objects. And those with a good eye will be able to see there are some toys mixed in with the rubbish. Another example further afield comes from Mexico, and researchers there have uncovered that certain species of birds have started to take the fibers from cigarette butts and incorporate them into their nests, which you can see in this image here. Now, the chemicals that are contained in these cigarette fibers actually inhibit the proliferation of nest parasites. So these birds are able to enjoy better fledgling success by incorporating these cigarette butts into their nests. But there are also many examples of negative impacts of human-altered environments on wildlife. An example comes from Western Australia. Scientists in the 1980s in bushland outside the township of Dongara, which is situated about 300 kilometres north of Perth, came across a really bizarre sight. It seemed that male jewel beetles had developed a sexual attraction for empty beer bottles that had been strewn in the bush as rubbish. Now, what was happening here was that the male beetles were being drawn to the brown shiny surface of the beer bottles, which bear a striking resemblance to the brown shiny forewings or elytra of the female beetles, except there's one very important difference, and that is that beer bottles are much larger than real females. So the beer bottles were acting as a supernormal sexy stimulus, attracting the males to the beer bottles instead of to real females. And these males suffered a cost. They were wasting their time and energy, and the researchers also observed that these males were being attacked by meat ants. In Europe, there is evidence to suggest that with global warming, there is now a mismatch between the timing of the arrival of migratory birds to the breeding site and also the peak flush of insect food available for feeding their nestlings. In cities, the advertisement calls and songs of animals that are produced to try and attract mates are being drowned out by urban noise. And a good example of this is seen in frogs. In North America, birds such as this red cardinal are suffering reduced fledgling success because of changes to the environment. So in this particular species, males get these bright red plumage from the carotenoid-rich fruits that they eat. And we know that these birds like to nest close to their food source. Now, in certain parts of North America, these birds have started to nest inside the branches of an invasive shrub called the Amur honeysuckle, because these shrubs produce lots and lots of these carotenoid-rich fruits. But nesting in these shrubs are actually a very poor choice or decision for these birds, because the open structure of the shrubs actually make the nestlings more vulnerable to predators. And my own research about 15 years ago in the streams of Mexico uncovered how chemical pollution in the environment was messing up the ability of female swordtail fish to be able to smell out males of their own species. And as a result, females were making mistakes during mate choice and actually mating with males of another closely related species, resulting in mating system breakdown and the loss of biodiversity in some of these streams. Now, this last example really also underscores chemical pollution as an insidious form of environmental change. And in recent decades, concern has been mounting over a particular group of chemical pollutants, and they are pharmaceuticals. So I'm sure everyone here in the audience appreciates the therapeutic benefits of the medicines that we take or that we give to our beloved pets or to our livestock. But what's not very well appreciated is that vast quantities of these drugs can actually end up in the environment. The reason for this is that many of the medicines that we take actually remain biologically active when they're excreted. And most modern wastewater treatment processes, while they're very good at removing the nutrients and the chunky bits, they're not so good at removing chemicals such as pharmaceuticals. So they do, as a result, end up in the environment. And once they're in the environment, they're a cause for concern for several reasons. First of all, pharmaceuticals have now become ubiquitous. They're found even in the most remote places on the planet. Alarmingly, a paper published a few years ago reported the presence of pharmaceuticals in the tissues of fish and invertebrates living adjacent to one of the research stations in Antarctica. So even really far-flung places, we're seeing evidence of pharmaceutical pollution. Now, many of these drugs also tend to be highly environmentally persistent. One of the drugs we've been working on, which I'll talk about a little later, called Trenbolone, a veterinary pharmaceutical, has a half-life of some 270 days in the environment. Pharmaceuticals in the environment are also a cause for concern because many of the receptors that are targeted by these drugs tend to be evolutionarily conserved among different animal groups. And what that means is that drugs that have been designed for you or I can also have unintended consequences when they are exposed to wildlife. And alarmingly, we know that we can oftentimes see effects at extremely low concentrations, in some cases nanograms per litre or parts per trillion. Now, one of the most infamous examples of a rather dramatic effect of pharmaceutical pollution was reported a few years ago in vultures living on the Indian subcontinent. Various species, populations of 3 different species of vultures actually collapsed because the birds were ingesting pharmaceuticals from tainted wildlife carcasses that they were feeding on. Now, some pharmaceuticals are known endocrine disruptors, which means that they have the capacity to interfere with the normal hormone functioning of organisms. And one of the most famous examples of this is the contraceptive pill, and you might have heard about this in the media. We know, for example, that the active ingredient of the contraceptive pill, once in the environment, can cause all kinds of nasty effects, including sex change, in this case, feminization of male fish. It's also been shown to alter the brain structure of birds that have fed on tainted invertebrates living amongst wastewater treatment facilities in the United Kingdom. And this affects the songs that the birds produce, which are important for attracting mates. Members of my research group and I have also been looking at a pharmaceutical that's a known endocrine disruptor, one that has masculinizing effects. It's a hormonal growth promotant called trenbolone. Banned by the European Union since the 1980s, trenbolone is still widely used in many parts of the world, including here in Australia. So to provide some context, of the around 2.3 million tonnes of beef cattle that we produce every year, about 40% involve animals that have been treated with hormonal growth promotants. Trenbolone is a powerful synthetic steroid. It has 15 to 50 times the potency of testosterone. And those of you who are into, I guess, going to the gym may be familiar with trenbolone because it is also one of these drugs that's occasionally abused by bodybuilders. But in livestock, when it's administered in the form of growth implants as trenbolone acetate, it very rapidly breaks down into a biologically active metabolite called 17-beta-trenbolone. And it's this 17-beta-trenbolone that actually ends up in the environment via livestock effluent runoff. And as a result, trenbolone has been detected in the environment at concentrations ranging from 5 to 162 nanograms per litre. Now, earlier I spoke about trenbolone as being a pharmaceutical with an extremely long half-life, 270 days. Now, scientists a few years ago figured out why. So this chemical actually will break down during the daytime when exposed to UV, but has the ability to reform again under the cover of darkness, leading to scientists to refer to trenbolone as a zombie or vampire steroid. Now, I'm sure everyone, well, I guess most people here have gone through the angst of puberty and are very well aware of the intimate link between hormones and sex. So members of my research group and I were interested in trying to understand how exposure of wildlife to trenbolone, in this case fish, might affect their reproductive behaviours and mechanisms of sexual selection. We decided to do this in a species of fish called the guppy, which some of you might be familiar with because it's a popular aquarium fish. It's a species that's native to the beautiful streams of Trinidad and northeastern Venezuela, but has also been introduced to tropical and subtropical regions right around the world, including here in Australia. And in some of these habitats, the fish are exposed to all kinds of chemical pollutants, including agricultural pollutants. Now, the other reason why we wanted to work on guppies was because their reproductive antics are already very well studied. They're a model system in behavioural and evolutionary biology. The species is sexually dimorphic, and that basically means that males and females look very different from one another. In this image here, the male is the one on the top. He's brightly coloured, has all these different coloured spots, and the female, by comparison, is relatively drab. Now, what's interesting about this species is that it's internally fertilized. So this is the second dick pic of the night. So just below the male's belly, you can see this elongated fin, which is a modified anal fin called a gonopodium, which he actually uses as an intromittent organ to inseminate the female. And he can try and achieve copulations in one of two ways. He can either try and court females by displaying his bright colors and engaging in a courtship display called a sigmoid display. And we know from previous studies that female guppies are highly selective about their choice of mating partners, and they prefer males that have more orange spots and larger patches of orange. And the amount of orange, it seems, is related to the male's genetic quality. So by choosing males that are more orange, she's selecting a good male that will hopefully sire offspring that are also of high genetic quality. Now, the second way that males can achieve copulations is what evolutionary biologists call sneak copulations. And as his name suggests, involves a male sneaking up behind the female when she's not looking and trying to inseminate her that way. And of course, this second strategy actually bypasses female mate choice. So let's look at the impacts of trenbolone on the reproductive behaviours of males and females. So first of all, males. We found that exposure of male guppies to trenbolone for 3 to 4 weeks resulted in all kinds of changes. First up, we found that the male guppies bulked up. They increased their body condition, which might not be so surprising given that this is a hormonal growth promotant that's specifically designed to improve meat yields. We also found that male guppies became more aggressive during competition with rivals. They courted less, and this reduction in courtship was matched by an increase in the number of sneak copulations. So remember, this second form of mating strategy actually bypasses female mate choice for males of superior genetic quality. So what about females? Well, we found that in females, exposure to trenbolone resulted in females being less interested and less responsive to the presence of males. And when they were being choosy, they actually became less discerning. They were less picky about whether the males had lots of orange or not. So hopefully I've convinced you that sex is very important and is easily disturbed by human-induced changes to the natural world with important ecological and evolutionary consequences. And in particular, pharmaceutical pollutants in the environment are a cause for concern because of their potential to disrupt reproduction in non-target wildlife. And with that, I want to thank my various collaborators, in particular, Michael and Patrick, who were the PhD students who led a lot of the research that I spoke about today. Thank you.
Much.
Yes, fantastic talks. Thank you so much. I have a question for you, Bob, actually, about what we can do to limit our impact on the environment in terms of sort of pharmaceutical contamination.
Okay, that's a really good question. Please don't stop taking your medicines. I think each of us have a role to play. A lot of people don't realize that you shouldn't throw your unused medicines in the trash or flush them down the toilet. So that's one thing that you can stop doing right away. If you do have any unused medicines, you should bring them back to the pharmacy and they'll dispose of them in a way that's less harmful to the environment. I think that's a really important thing that we can all do in a small way. I think it's also about making regulators aware of the problems. So I have been to conferences and I've been really alarmed by just how low on the radar pharmaceutical pollution is. I think there's a lot of emphasis on things like heavy metals and other toxicants in the environment. And pharmaceuticals fall within a group that are known as emerging environmental contaminants. I guess they've been around for a long time, but they're emerging in our consciousness. So I think as regulators become more and more aware of this, hopefully that will also affect changes to wastewater treatment practices that can hopefully remove a bit more of this kind of stuff before they're released into the environment.
Guy, do you have anything to add in terms of like pharmaceuticals? Is there, I'm sure some plants that are harmful to indigenous plants like can go in the environment. So is there mechanisms within like indigenous culture that would mitigate the risk of pollutants like that?
Yeah, completely. I think a lot of medicinal frameworks that come from indigenous backgrounds are they're pre what's the right, I don't know, it's before sickness and injury occurs. So we have ancestral practices like yoga, which is incredibly well documented practice to calm your nervous system and oxygenate your blood and increase your well-being and health and vitality and your responsiveness to your environment. other a lot of other cultures have very, very successful medicinal practices that don't necessarily require chemical medicines. So like, for example, Chinese medicine is largely herb based. It's very, very knowledge intensive. So you can't just go around and have, like, you know, just random herbs from the ground. Obviously that wouldn't work. But there are ways that you can engage in alternative medicines that are very, very useful for your health and well-being, and would mean that you didn't have to take those chemicals. Yeah.
All right. Any questions? Here you go. One here.
Okay, that's working. Well, first of all, both those were fantastic. Thank you so much. This was a question for Bob, and I was when you were talking about pharmaceuticals in wastewater, I was thinking of a study I saw about, yes, recreational less than legal drugs in wastewater. And I got me thinking, has there been any studies about the effects of those in an ecological sense, or is that still kind of too new or potentially taboo?
Yeah, that's a good question. Colleagues in Sweden have access to things like cocaine for scientific purposes, and I think there are some plans in train to look at how those kinds of drugs, which do end up in the environment as well, might affect organisms. I have a PhD student who just recently started doing some work with caffeine. So you can imagine caffeine is actually ubiquitous. I had a meeting with some colleagues in Canada this morning, and they said that caffeine is even in their tap water. So we're planning to do an experiment, and we needed fish to be in pure fresh water, but we found that even the tap water coming out of the lab has caffeine in it. Victorian water is a little bit better than that, but we do find caffeine in waterways throughout the state.
Hi, fantastic talks, really interesting. I've got a question about compost toilets. I've got friends with compost toilets, and they were saying that they were taking, you know, it's what goes into the toilet gets mixed with sawdust, and they were saying, oh, well, because some of the students coming to learn permaculture there were, you know, they might be on the pill or they might be on medication or whatever. They were saying that they just put the contents in a bucket, like they just put it away for like a year and a half, and were hoping that by then whatever was in there would have broken down enough not to cause a problem in the garden or in the environment. And do you know how long these things take to break down?
It really depends. These colleagues in Sweden who potentially will be working on cocaine soon have also been working on a group of antidepressants, the benzodiazepines. And in Sweden, you can do things like pour pharmaceuticals into lakes and do research on them, on what happens. And what they found was that 3 years after they introduced the particular pharmaceutical, oxazepam, into these lakes, there's still traces of it in the lake 3 years later. And that might be because of, you know, the climatic conditions in Sweden, the low temperatures. But yeah, it does seem to depend. So I don't know specifically about the contraceptive pill, but there is some data out there in terms of, you know, half-lives and things. So yeah, that information is available, but I think it really depends on the environmental conditions.
Thanks very much.
Hi, Guy.
Hi.
But this one's, I guess, for, I'm not sure if you do a lot of research the way that your colleagues do, Bob, but is it the ethical, is like the outcome worth contaminating lakes and other water systems and stuff like that, finding that research? Is that worth the outcome ethically? And like, how do you guys go about determining that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. You know, when we carry out research, oftentimes there are regulations that we have to follow. So certainly our research with animals like fish, here in Victoria, also research on certain invertebrates like cephalopods and crustaceans all require animal ethics. So these would have gone through a independent body that would have assessed exactly those kinds of questions. The other thing is that I don't think that kind of research can occur here in Australia, but in a place like Sweden, where they have literally thousands of lakes, the Swedish government has actually set aside certain lakes specifically for ecotoxicology research. And I think the kinds of findings that these scientists are now uncovering, the very first studies ever to be conducted in more naturalistic settings, I think is really, really important and powerful. You can do a lot of studies, of course, in a laboratory setting, but how well these results translate into real-world settings is questionable. And I think we do need to have experiments at different levels and scales of ecological complexity. And when you consider just how much is actually just being pumped into the environment from our everyday use, I think researchers getting permission to dose a lake system with a toxicant for scientific purposes to enrich our knowledge of what's going on and hopefully give us a better understanding so we can actually develop measures to try and mediate the impacts. I think the ends do, in this case, justify the means.
Guy, I was wondering what your advice would be for urban dwellers like us. Is there some way that we can truly live in better symbiosis, I guess, with our environment? What can we do in real terms to make a difference here living in Melbourne, for example?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's really hard in an urban context because there is it's hard to have a sympathetic understanding of the ecosystem because you're not necessarily embedded in it. So a lot of the onus is on the systems that you rely upon. So, for example, a primary sort of industry that you rely upon living in urban areas is obviously your food supply. So a lot of people don't know this, but Coles and Woolworths is primarily supplied by large monocropping chemical agriculture. And the impacts that those industries have on the environment is so destructive. And we do have the likes of sort of Open Food Network, which is a coordinator of regenerative agriculture in Victoria. How and what you eat is a really powerful way that you can support the ecosystem, and also being conscious of what where your money is. So where you bank, how you bank, and where you purchase has huge implications because money does talk. So I would recommend looking into where are you storing all your money? What is the ethics behind that company? There's a fantastic group called Market Force that literally has done all the work for you. So go to them, plug in your details, and they'll tell you how to make your money work for you and also for the environment. And then I guess figuring out what are your other inputs. Realistically, what we have to do as a society is have a full, complete audit of where all of our inputs come from and make them sustainable. And that's a huge job. But the good thing about it is once it's done, it's done. Like we continue to avoid and sit in a space of denial because it is difficult work, but it's going to sit there until either we have full ecosystem collapse and more cascades of catastrophe, or we do something about it and shift into more regenerative models and styles of living. So I would just recommend figuring out what are your needs, where are you banking? Where are you getting your energy from? Does anyone know about streaming? Streaming has a huge carbon footprint. It's crazy. When you start to think about the sustainability of the sources of your being, things get a bit freaky, but then you cross that threshold and you start to realize there's stuff you can do about it. And that's what we need people to be doing. So yeah, thank you for that question.
All right. 1, 2, 3.
Hi, my name is Fanchi, and my question is, I think, probably for both of the speakers. I think Guy talked a lot about the effect and functions of things we do, what we are in the ecological system and environment. And so does Bob give us a really good presentation on how the things doesn't do what is intended in the environment. So my question would be, in terms of queer practices or ancestral practices, is there any examples of combining these practices in the real, in STEAM training and STEAM research? So what would that look like? Or if there's any examples of us doing that?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really, really good question. Well, a general thing that I would like to say first up is that years ago, I did a course where the facilitator said, you know, what is it that you can bring to the role that no one else can bring? And I was sitting there going, I don't know. I thought anyone can do what I'm doing. But it was only years later that I realized that what the facilitator was really talking about was about bringing all of us into the things that we do. And so for me, it's my cultural background. It's the fact that I'm a gay man. All of those things are assets. So not just in the context of science, I would say that, you know, whatever your profession is, I hope that you bring all of yourself to that role. So that's a general statement. In terms of, if I can sort of talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge, I think there's a really good understanding now that if we really are to address some of the world's most pressing problems, it's important to look to First Nations peoples and their deep ties to the environment, because they are part of the key to trying to solve these issues, and we need to do it in partnership. I know colleagues who work in remote areas, for example, in Africa, who engage with local Indigenous communities, and I think that's a really important process. Mohammed talked about the importance of visibility, right? So one issue I think we're facing in Australia is that there aren't enough First Nations people pursuing careers in science. And I think that stems from a visibility issue. So I think engaging with Indigenous communities is really important. And I have colleagues right around the world doing just that. And also in terms of tapping into Indigenous knowledge, I remember hearing a talk years ago from a herpetologist who works with local communities. They go out and help with these frogs. These frogs actually bury themselves underground. And the researcher was telling a story about how the local community, when they were harvesting these frogs for food, would always leave the small ones behind and just take the big ones, so that there would be more in the future. And I think that's such a nice example of sustainability being practiced by an Indigenous community who probably, you know, hadn't really heard about the concept of sustainability, but they were practicing it. So I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas, and we really should be tapping into that a lot more.
Yeah. And to add to that as well, the understanding of queer knowledge and queer roles in traditional sort of ancestral spaces is really difficult to connect to, because it was one of the first things to be colonized and removed out of culture. But for example, a good friend of mine, Tyson Juncker-Porter, he has a fantastic book that I recommend everyone read, Sand Talk. And there's a section in there that talks about the roles of queer people in Indigenous settings. So I'm not going to speak too much on that space because it's not my realm, but there are incredibly powerful roles based on who and what you are and how you identify as. And also in the Pacific as well, we have whawhawhenus, and whawhawhene is a beautiful cultural acceptance and an example that the rest of our culture should understand. Whawhawhene is an umbrella term, or can be used as an umbrella term for the LGBTQIA community, but also in families, they will raise one of their children as a woman. And so they will grow up in that queer existence, or they will decide to transition themselves, and they just are raised, and that's how they live their life, and it's completely accepted and it's not questioned. And that's something that our sort of Western overculture can take a huge amount of information from. Also in Māori culture, we have takatapui, which is sort of Māori homosexual. And there's a lot of sort of origin stories about how and what our role was and who and what our social stance was. And whether or not that is in a science realm, or it's in an agricultural realm, or it's in a marketing realm, there is still a very significant role that queer people play, and it actually does belong in our ancestry, and it's really difficult to find, and that's just sad, really. But it is there, and I hope one day to have more resources, or even a book that compiles queer, Indigenous, and ancestral understandings.
Sure, happen. Do we have an online question?
Yes, we do have a question from Bridget online, and she asks one that sort of follows on from just what you were saying there. She says, do you know of any good resources for researching ancestral ecological practices?
Is this working? Okay. It would depend on who you are and what your ancestry is. If you can find out who that is. There's like ancestry.com, which I would not recommend because it's pretty much just like, it's like commercialized and very, so if you have white ancestry, go there. That'll help you out. If you're anyone else, not really going to be helpful.
Just to jump in there, that's how you know how white someone is. Only white people go on ancestry.com.
Yeah, but truly the real meaningful knowledge actually exists in your elders, and that is not easy. That requires you to put in work, and that requires you to be present for their yarn, and that's something that's seriously lacking in our culture. We would like things to be conveniently written with all of the answers so we can read them and have them and then look at them and, oh, that's nice, that's fantastic. But actually sitting in that space, talking to your elders, figuring out really what is the access that you have right in this space is the place that I would recommend to go to. You can do all of the readings, but it pales in comparison to actually being there with your family, with your grandparents, if you have access to them, or anyone else who shares your culture. Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of books. I don't know what books, but there are them.
We're running out of time, but I have to ask my questions. I know. No, okay, important questions. All right. Guy, you spoke about ecological succession. My question is to do with the relationship between ecological succession and climate change, because the effects are quite obvious. How much time and how can we rework ecological succession to take into account rising temperatures? And you're basically, when you say ecological succession, you're trying to hit a dot like in a moving target. So how do you do it? Because, you know, there's no solution but to do it now. We can't stop climate change, wait for the ecosystem to recover. So is there anything you would like to?
So there's this sort of notion that I really get angry at out there. It's like, oh, we've only got 50 years, or we've got this amount of time. And that's based on the assumption that we don't do anything about it. And I'm really angry with that, because it's that statement aligns to the fact that we're choosing to roll over and do absolutely nothing about it, which is not what we're going to do. And so this idea of how long do we have is really based on how much we choose to show up for it. And I mean, specifically in the activist spaces, it's really hard because we have a sort of quantity of movement, cultural movement, behavioral movement, societal movement that is being shouldered by a small number of people, when in reality it could be a very tiny amount of change done by a lot of people. And that's, like I said before, where we choose to buy our food. It's difficult because the framework of change that we have is really misunderstood. We relinquish a lot of agency when it comes to how we engage with a lot of the systems that we prop up ourselves through purchasing, through choosing to continue to prop up industries or spaces that don't necessarily need to have that support, and that comes down to education. So I think realistically, if I don't have an answer for how long.
Like I think to clarify myself, I was just saying, like, can we modify ecological succession in any way to have a more potent and quicker ecological succession?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So there's sorry, I completely misunderstood your question. Well, so there's a thing in permaculture called accelerated succession. So this is where you come in and identify at which point is this ecosystem, where is it at in the succession process. And then because of the patterns, because of how we know the development of ecology, we can then start bringing in these keystone species and accelerated sort of organisms to start that process. But we need people doing that, and we need people demanding that, and we need people having and supporting petitions and ensuring that these things are happening, because they're largely underfunded, they run off privilege and luck, and everyone's getting burnt out really in that space. Yeah.
All right. I just have one question for both of you. This is like the lobby stuff. So if you have any napkins, get them out. No, that's fine. No, at what point for both of you did your identity contribute to your work? I understand that it's an engulfing thing, but which point in your pursuit of being who you are today did your identity kind of make you more than your peers? And when I say more, I mean more aware of who you are, because yeah, people are not aware sometimes.
Yeah, I'd say pretty recently, actually. I sort of fell more confidently into who I am, how I present, how I speak. And I realized that all of these spaces I was going into, like regenerative agriculture spaces and activism spaces, a lot of people just got really, really confused by who I was because of how I presented. And there was so much confusion. And for me, that was pure privilege, because people would be suspended in this space being like, I don't know what the hell is going on there. You don't fit into anything that I'm trying to box you into. And I'm kind of in a state of shock. And in that suspension, I'm allowed to sort of push my ethical agenda to try and make sure that the meaningful change that I believe I'm trying to bring is occurring. And so for me, I believe it's a blessing to be who I am and to be a part of this community.
Yeah, I feel the same way. For me, I think also fairly recently, but for slightly different reasons. As an academic, it suddenly dawned on me maybe 5 years ago that, you know, as I'm becoming more and more senior, there comes a lot of privilege and platform to really be more of an advocate. It's kind of funny because during my own early career, there were really pivotal moments when I realized that these things mattered, but it was only 5 years ago or so that I realized that, or actually now I'm the one who can actually, you know, be in a position to be visible. So when I was an early career researcher, when I was still a student, I had the most amazing lecturers at uni. I studied at ANU in Canberra. And I remember going to an international conference and meeting this professor by the name of Andy C. And I didn't realize from his surname that he was actually of Chinese heritage. And so meeting this guy, oh, wow, he's of Chinese heritage, and hearing that he was born in China, but then moved to the US, spoke with an American accent, and was a very successful behavioral ecologist. And it was the first time that I realized, oh, hang on, maybe I too can carve out a successful career as a behavioral ecologist. And then years later, when I did my first postdoc in North America, the researcher that I worked with, he and his wife had lots of gay friends, and meeting other scientists who were gay also was a real eye-opener for me. So, you know, it comes back to the whole issue of visibility. But for me, it's only here in the last 5 years, I guess I'm a bit slow, that I realized, oh, hang on, now I'm in the position where I could actually be up on a stage, and hopefully there's someone in the audience who might aspire to a career in science who can see themselves reflected back.
That's very wonderful. Is this working? Yeah. Yeah. You know what they say? Identity is like falling in love. It never comes too late. I was going to say something else, but I was like, keep it PG, yo. Keep it PG. Thank you both for coming. Everyone, please be an advocate also. Yeah. Tell me, I got you. I got you. I got you. We have nibbles after. So make sure you eat the nibbles. We have a little drinky drink, a little chatty chat. But before we let you go, just parting remarks. Find us. This is us, QueersInScience. Please, we need more people because, you know, we can't have too many queer people in STEM. Yeah, also, if you have any questions to any of the speakers, send an email and we kind of, we'll get you in touch. And now I'm going to hand over to Sophia to speak on behalf of RSV. Yeah. All right. We can sit here, it's fine.
All right, fantastic. Nice having an audience to the right of me as well as in front of me. That's not stressful at all. So I'm here representing the Royal Society of Victoria, which has been working with QueersInScience on the seminar series. It's very weird to be talking about the Royal Society of Victoria when we've just spent a lot of time talking about how this land was stolen. Because you might guess by the name, the Royal Society of Victoria, that the Queen's involved in us, sort of obliquely. The sort of history of the Royal Society of Victoria is we were founded back in the 1850s. We've got an extremely old building just down the road. And we work for science communication and encouragement throughout the state of Victoria. And that includes both sort of like, we do a seminar series that's pretty regular. We host workshops. We have a really high value on Indigenous science and refer to our Indigenous scientists as the first scientists, really, as they should be, as every Royal Society in Australia should call them. And we do things like this, which absolutely makes my heart burst with joy. For those of you who joined us last year for the inaugural QueersInScience and Royal Society of Victoria lecture series back in January 2020 in the before times, it was fantastic. It was the first time I saw people like me talking about science, like the science I want to do. Today, we've had a panel essentially of 3 non-white queer scientists talking. How cool is that, right? Like, I cannot overstate this. So my role right now is to essentially like collect thoughts on what's just happened here and to essentially like give thanks and sort of pay tribute to the 2 wonderful people who have just spoken today. And I'll try to keep it short because I know that Mohammed's got everyone thinking about nibbles and drinks. Guy gave this fantastic talk about weaving cultural ideas and like that just entirely wove cultural ideas and complex ecological ideas together. I love to be challenged by a talk. And whenever someone finishes off a talk by quite aggressively asking, who are you? Yeah, it's a challenge, right? Like as a New Zealander, I love to hear the ideas of Te Ao Māori in Australia, and I'm never not talking about them, as anyone who knows me can tell. But the question of who are you really struck me, because certainly I can talk about, I can do my pepeha, I can talk about my whakapapa, but I think about my ancestors, and I just come from this very long line of farmers who certainly didn't do very much for ecological conservation. You know, I've got kind of like 500 to 1,000 years behind me of just kind of messing with the environment a bit, and not doing it any favors, really. It's been, I hate this word, but it's been inspirational. It's inspirational. It's inspiring, I think, everyone here to engage with our land and our ecologies more. I think often, as many of us being city dwellers in Melbourne, we can kind of shrug off the idea that we're part of this interconnected ecosystem. And I think Guy did a fantastic job of bringing us back down to earth and reality a little bit with that. And then we heard from Professor Bob Wong, who gave us this incredible whistle-stop tour of sex in the natural world, and then our impacts on it as well. It's horrifying. I love, love a good horrifying talk. Because hearing about pharmaceuticals and hearing more about pharmaceuticals in the Q&A afterwards was eye-opening to me. I certainly knew about fertilizers and nitrogen runoff. Dairy cows are ruining the world. Why do I love cheese? But it's wonderful to hear that like the research is being done and the work is being done. Both of you are truly putting in the mahi, putting in the work to make the world a better place. And now you've planted, I think we had 72 additional little seeds of people that are going to go out there and change their behavior, because I certainly know that I will. But probably after these nibbles, because the sunk cost fallacy exists for a reason, and I don't care where they came from if they're nice. So I'm moving the vote of thanks, which I presume everyone will accept, on behalf of the Royal Society of Victoria, to thank so much from the deepness of my heart, Guy Ritani and Professor Bob Wong for their talks tonight. And now you're all free to go.
Probably thanks our other sponsors, you know, Melbourne Museum. Thank you so much for all your work. Thank you. Yeah. Everyone, let's go eat and get drinking. Let's do this thing.